The possibility of setting up a judicial panel on the 21st of September, and that's exactly what the government has done today. Joining us now, CNBC-TV18 exclusive Justice R.V. Easwar, the head of the Income Tax Committee that's just been set up by the government. And also joining us is Mr. Ketan Dalal, Senior Tax Partner at PwC. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us. Justice Easwar, if I can start by asking you, sir, because I'm looking at the terms of reference. It says to study provisions in the Act which are leading to litigation, to study provisions which are impacting the ease of doing business, for simplification in the light of existing jurisprudence. It's all very broad and, if I may say so, vague, sir. Can you throw some light on what specific issues or areas your panel is going to address?
Actually, I can't fully agree with you that these are vague terms. There are actually four of reference, and the main idea, thrust of the terms of reference appears to me to be that the litigation should be reduced to the bare minimum than what is precisely necessary, and that itself is a simplification, and that is why they have said in clause number 2 of the terms of reference clause number 1, identify the provisions and phrases of the Act which lead to litigation. So if there is simplification and clarity on certain terms, for example, there are several incentive provisions, Chapter 6A. There are several terms which have not been clearly defined. That is one area which the committee will probably be looking at. Then the other area will be the Section 9, where there are certain terms which have been judicially interpreted in a certain way. And whether anything can be done to achieve uniformity in the way in which those terms have been interpreted by different tribunals and courts. That would be one area, so that the litigation becomes minimum, which automatically will answer the term number 2, which is ease of business, ease of doing business. If there is less litigation, there is better way of, there's ease of doing business. This is one aspect which we would like to examine. The other aspect is that there are two kinds of provisions in the Income Tax Act broadly. One is the substantive provisions and the other is the procedural provisions. The scope for simplification in the substantive provisions will have to be conditioned by term number 4, which says it should, without substantially impacting on the tax base. So there probably the scope is not as much as the simplification process of the procedural provisions. The procedural provisions will also impact term number 2, ease of doing business, and there are certain cumbersome rules, procedures, forms to be filled up, which probably need to be simplified. And this is one area which the committee would like to look at. This is my prima facie thing, prima facie view. And we have experts from all sides, the chartered accountancy profession, the former law secretary is there, then the investment side is also represented, and we have some very competent and able officers from the Revenue Service. So I think all these issues will be addressed.
You've been able to articulate for us now more clearly, sir, on what we can expect in terms of the areas that the committee is going to be looking at. But if I could get you to expand for us, sir, what you said as far as Section 9 is concerned, and if I could get you to link that to the terms of reference and clause number 4 in the terms of reference, which says to suggest alternatives and modifications to existing provisions and areas so identified to bring about predictability and certainty in tax laws, sir. This has been the big bugbear as far as investors are concerned. The retrospective tax law that was brought in by the former UPA government. This is going to be something that you will be addressing, a possible modification as far as the retrospective amendment to Section 9, sir?
That is right. But I have to enter a caveat here. You see, this Income Tax Act has been there since 1961 for almost now 55 years. Now, there are several views have been taken in respect of almost all the provisions, either by the courts or the tribunals and all that, and also by the authority for advance ruling. Now, there has to be a reconciliation wherever there is a conflicting interpretation. Number two, it has always been my view that simplification is probably the most difficult. It's not so simple to simplify. If the business models have become complex over the years, it is no longer a very simple business model with cross-border investments and all that. If the business models have become complex, perhaps, I'm inclined to think that the tax laws also need to be a little, complex to meet those complex situations. But the secret lies in trying to be as less complex as possible. So I would rather think of dealing with those situations the way in which the government wants, but in not so much of a complex language, but a simple language, so that everyone is clear, and therefore the litigation is brought to minimum. And so time and expense in litigation is not lost.
Understood, sir. Justice Easwar, if I could just take that point forward, what would this mean? Because you've said that the committee will look at the issue of retrospectivity, specifically retrospectivity with regards to Section 9. What would it then mean, sir, for the ongoing cases, for cases where arbitration proceedings have already been initiated, for instance, in Vodafone, for cases which are currently in court, sir?
No, I didn't say anything about retrospectivity, because that is probably not the scope of the terms of reference. It is entirely for the government to consider whether the provision for taxation is to be prospective or retrospective. I don't see anything in the terms of reference to the committee to deal with that situation. So I think that is outside the scope of this.
Okay. Let me just also bring in Ketan Dalal, who's listening in. Mr. Dalal, you've listened to what Justice Easwar has had to say. Any comments or any questions that you would have for Justice Easwar, sir?
So, first of all, Shirin, it's a privilege to be on the show with Justice Easwar. Really privileged. A couple of things, as Justice Easwar pointed out, the substantive and the procedural part, and it is on the second one that I do want to make a couple of comments. My belief has been that in the context of the Indian income tax legislation, the procedural and the administrative part is as important, and sometimes I think even more important than the substantive part. And specifically when you link it to the ease of doing business, I do hope that the committee will go into quite a few of those provisions. So, for example, provisions relating to withholding taxes and tax reduction at source has been a major issue for corporates who actually say that, look, on the one hand, we are doing the job for the government, and on top of that, we are visited with multiple number of adverse consequences in litigious matters where we believe that we should not have deducted, and the government thinks we should have, or the tax department thinks we should have. So those kind of controversies, say, for example, let's say a foreign company required to take a PAN number, that directly impacts ease of doing business and becomes a major issue on the ground, things like that. On the substantive part, there are provisions like, let's say, for example, in the context of companies undertaking restructuring, there are a large number of provisions which are really not, either redundant or not practical. So, for example, impracticalities in the definition of demerger and things like that. So I do hope that the committee will consider all these in the context
Let me just put that across to Justice Easwar, who's also listening in. Justice Easwar, you heard what Ketan Dalal hopes will be looked into by the committee. Would you confirm, sir, whether those are going to be areas of interest and part of the terms of reference, sir?
In any legislation, over a period of years, experience shows that there is some deadwood and that has to be cut and removed. That I fully agree with Mr. Ketan Dalal. Number two, I am not able to agree with him fully that payment of taxes will affect the ease of doing business. After all, if you do business and earn profits, you need to pay tax. And if you need to pay tax, the Income Tax Act recognizes only two modes of payment broadly. One is by way of deduction, the other is by way of after the demand is created. Now, if there are some areas which affect the provisions, the ease of deduction and remittance of tax and all that can always be addressed. But there cannot be any fundamental change in the position that tax has to be either deducted or paid on demand. So, but certainly this is an area in which we need to take the views of stakeholders to the extent that this should not be made complicated. That is the only thing. That's how I look at it.
Okay. Justice Easwar, we're also hearing that perhaps the committee will also look at exemptions that may have outlived their utility or exemptions that are distorting the tax environment. And of course, this in the context of the finance minister saying that they will start to weed out exemptions as they move towards a corporate tax rate of 25%. Are exemptions going to be under the purview of the panel, sir?
Certainly, because that will, if you have a number of exemptions and incentives for deductions. I'm making a distinction between exemption and deduction, as the Act itself has made such a distinction. If you have a number of exemptions and deductions, it's certainly going to confuse the taxpayer. Large corporate entities may not be so bad. They have quality professional assistance, but for a simple taxpayer, it is rather complicated to understand the exemptions and calculate and compute it. So probably from that angle, I think, and also that the government has always been saying that the exemptions should be reduced to the minimum. I think there is a lot of scope there to simplify the provisions relating to exemptions and also Chapter 6A deductions, which are generally known as incentives to the business and industry. So there is certainly scope in respect of exemptions and deductions, yes.
Right. So, you know, the country is going to be watching what you have to say as far as Section 9 is concerned. You said that the terms of reference do not include the aspect of looking at whether something should be applied retrospectively or not. But if you can clarify once again for us, sir, as far as Section 9 is concerned, as part of the terms of reference, what exactly is it that the committee will be looking at, sir, and whether there will be any comments offered on what happens if there is, in fact, a Supreme Court order and a law is amended retrospectively? Is that going to be something that you would be considering at all as part of the terms of reference?
As I told you earlier, the terms of reference do not refer to any prospective retrospectivity and all that. So in the course of the discussions, if something comes up, certainly the committee will be open to consider them. And then if there is some substance and if the stakeholders raise valid points, perhaps there is scope for including them in the report, in the committee's recommendations. But basically, as I told you, it is entirely for the government to legislate prospectively or retrospectively, even in tax legislation.
Well, that is, of course, the government's prerogative. But Justice Easwar and Ketan Dalal, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC-TV18 and taking us through the terms of reference of what is the committee that's been set up by the government. This is an important move towards simplification and providing predictability and certainty as far as the tax environment is concerned. And the committee's recommendations, or at least a large part of the committee's recommendations, are expected to come in by January. Justice Easwar, it's been an absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for joining us on CNBC-TV18. That is the big exclusive tonight. But coming